I'm Audrey. At 28, I had carefully buried the parts of myself that once felt like destiny: the prodigy, the trophy, the child whose future had been mapped out in 2-hour practice blocks and stern lectures, along with the heavy expectations my mother carried like an heirloom. For a long time I lived under the single label our family had chosen for me: disappointment. Cassandra, my sister, wore perfection the way some people wear perfume, effortless and everywhere. Cassandra was 3 years older and blessed with a kind of ease I both admired and resented. She had the looks, the grades, the friends, the dates. She could walk into a room and own it without trying. My mother, Judith, adored that, proud, loud, eager to display Cassandra like a prize. When people complimented Cassandra, my mother's chest swelled. When they looked past me, my mother's jaw tightened and her plans for me hardened. The day my mother announced, flat and final, like a decree, "Audrey will provide some background music during cocktail hour," not a request, a statement, I felt a pinch of something I'd spent a decade trying to dull: the old, familiar electrical thrill that came before a performance, the part of me that still heard harmonies in the hum of fluorescent lights. It arrived uninvited, and with it the memory of every set of hands that had demanded I be someone else's dream. I started piano at 4. My fingers found the keys as if they belonged there, an instinct I didn't question. By 6 I was playing music adults called difficult. My mother's own childhood piano had gone quiet after marriage and children, but when she heard me, the old hunger reawakened. She became evangelical about my talent. At church, at school fundraisers, at family brunches: "This one has the gift. Audrey is going to be the concert pianist I always knew we needed in this family." Everyone nodded. People with prizes to hand out looked at me differently. My childhood was regimented into practice sessions, 4 hours a day minimum, extra in the summer, twice as much when a teacher came to town. My mother stood behind me, a stopwatch in one hand and a wooden ruler in the other. The ruler was never loud, just a sharp reminder if my posture slacked or my wrists drooped. While other kids learned to fall off bikes and scrape knees, I learned to control my wrists, to listen for the exact shade of a chord. My father, George, was often absent, a corporate attorney whose travel schedule insulated him from household friction. When he did witness my mother's discipline, he would frown and retreat to the sanctuary of his study, his intervention a mild, ineffectual, "Listen to your mother, Audrey." His absence made it easier for my mother to make me into the project she'd never finished. Everything crescendoed when I was 16 and had qualified for the National Young Pianist competition. In the months before the audition, my life narrowed to practice, diets, and a suppression of everything teenage. No movies, no boyfriends, no sleepovers. My mother's voice ghosted every decision. "This is your moment. This is what we've sacrificed everything for." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to deserve her belief. But on stage, under the antiseptic glare of lights, in an auditorium of faces that felt like weather, I unraveled. I remember the first chord, clean, certain, then a hiccup, then the world closing over my fingers. Rachmaninoff's Third was a mountain I had climbed 100 times in the privacy of a practice room. But in that hall my legs turned to lead and my fingers betrayed me. I stopped. The silence that followed was a physical thing, heavy and sharp. I looked at my hands like they were strangers. My mother's face in the front row was not sympathy, it was hunger. Humiliation burned hotter than any shame I'd known. Afterward, in the car, there were no words, only the low hum of the engine and my mother's heavy breathing. When we walked back into the house she told me, calmly, without hysteria, "I've wasted 12 years of my life on you." I went to my room and, in the small dark space where a teenager hides her face from grown-up disappointment, I made a decision. I was done. Done with piano. Done with the expectation that my life's worth could be measured in trophies and accolades. I would finish school, choose something sensible, and never return to the instrument that had become a measuring stick for everyone else's hopes. I mostly kept that promise. I enrolled in a practical business program in college, took a job at a marketing firm, and learned the rhythms of adult work, meetings, metrics, lunch breaks that were not scored on technique. I cultivated a neutral life, one that didn't sing too loudly and didn't invite comparisons. I moved into a small apartment, kept a few houseplants alive, and discovered the quiet pleasure of choosing my own priorities. Joy returned in small measures: coffee with a friend who knew me outside of family narratives, a weekend hike where no one expected a recital. But music was never entirely gone. On some nights, alone in my apartment, I would hum a phrase and remember the precise weight of a certain Chopin arpeggio. Once, on a dare at a friend's party, I played something simple on a borrowed keyboard and felt, for a moment, the old kinship. I told myself it was nostalgia. I told myself I had been right to walk away. So when my mother announced Cassandra's wedding and declared my role in the minutes between hors d'oeuvres and toasts, something fragile inside me cracked and then, surprisingly, shifted. The past showed up at the edge of the present like a photograph I hadn't meant to take, the smell of polish on piano keys, the echo of a metronome, the shadow of her ruler. I felt anger, not just at Judith, but at all the lost choices and the years I'd allowed her voice to drown out my own. Her pronouncement wasn't a gentle request, it was the old script, the familiar choreography where I moved to someone else's cue, not a request, a statement. She said, the exact phrase that had once defined my childhood. Suddenly the choice I thought I'd made was being stolen back from me in a satin dress and floral arrangements. I could have refused, I could have said no, quietly, with the dignity I'd cultivated over years. But there was a different impulse too, curiosity, a flicker of defiance, the thought that maybe this time I could play on my own terms. So I began to think about the piano, not as a proving ground for my mother's ambitions, but as something that had once been mine, a language I'd loved before it had been weaponized. The memory of my fingers finding the keys returned, along with a slow, stubborn possibility. What if I returned not to please anyone, but to tell a story I hadn't been allowed to finish? If you're still here, I'll tell you, this is where the real part of the story begins, the rehearsal, the decisions I made about what to play, the small, clever ways I would answer my mother's certainty. Those details matter, because forcing me back to the piano, as Judith so confidently arranged, would turn out to be her miscalculation. What she thought would bind me to her narrative instead gave me a stage to reclaim my own. I saw the wedding coordinator whisper something into the ear of a waiter, who immediately set off at a brisk pace, presumably to fetch my mother. The old me would have panicked, imagining her scolding gaze boring into me, already rehearsing the words she'd use to cut me down. But not tonight. Tonight, I didn't care. I was lost in the music, fully consumed by it. My fingers had entered that rare state where they were no longer simply flesh and bone, but conduits, bridges between something ancient inside me and the instrument waiting to release it. I was deep in the breakdown section now, where the melody fractured into jagged, discordant fragments. For years, I had resisted chaos, forced to polish every imperfection until nothing remained of my own voice. But here, the chaos was mine. I let it spill out, layer upon layer, until it became almost unbearable, before guiding it, slowly, carefully, toward renewal. My body moved with it, shoulders swaying gently, breath catching in rhythm, as if the music itself carried me like a current. My hands flew across the keys with a freedom I hadn't felt in more than a decade. Each note seemed to scrub away the years of silence, the bitterness, the shame. Each chord was both confession and release. It was only when the terrace grew unnervingly still that I dared glance up, and what I saw startled me. A crowd had gathered, guests clustered around the piano, cocktails forgotten, conversations abandoned. The low buzz of polite wedding chatter had vanished, replaced by a silence charged with awe. Their eyes were on me. And among them stood Patricia, Richard's mother, regal in her dark blue gown, her face lit with admiration so genuine it nearly made me falter. She wasn't politely humoring me, she was transfixed. Then, movement, a figure forcing her way through the throng. My mother. Judith's expression flickered from confusion to alarm, her carefully composed mask beginning to crack. Our eyes locked for a heartbeat, sharp and electric, before I tore mine away and returned to the keys. This was the climax, the very heart of my composition. Here, the fragmented chaos resolved, not by erasing pain, but by transforming it into strength. It was the part of the piece I had always thought of as survival turned into song. My fingers danced, bold and unyielding, pulling from the Steinway a sound that felt too large for the glass terrace. Notes resonated off the windows and ceiling, filling the space in a way that seemed to press against the guests themselves. I became aware of the wetness on my cheeks, tears, unbidden and unashamed. I let them fall. The music spoke for me, louder than any words ever had. It told of loss and rediscovery, of passion stolen and passion reclaimed. It told the story of a girl silenced, now breaking free. From the corner of my vision, I spotted Cassandra and Richard at the edge of the crowd. Cassandra's hand was clamped tightly around her husband's arm, her expression softened with wonder, and beside them, my father, my distant, distracted father, stood still as stone, his face transformed by something I could only describe as recognition, as though, for the first time in years, he was actually seeing me. But my mother, oh, my mother, she looked stricken, colorless. Every ounce of her trademark composure had drained away. She had expected background music, ambience, a forgettable accessory to her carefully orchestrated event. What she got instead was a spotlight she could not dim. The final movement arrived like dawn after a storm. The melody returned, yes, but not unchanged. It was no longer the innocent tune of a child, but something forged in fire. Pain had sharpened it, experience had deepened it, resilience had strengthened it. The notes rang out, not seeking approval, but offering truth, a gift, raw and unfiltered, to anyone willing to receive it. The last chord fell like a curtain. I held it, letting the resonance linger until it faded into stillness. For a single breath, the terrace was silent, utterly, reverently silent. And then came the applause, a single clap at first, then another, then a wave that swelled into a thunderous roar. People stood, people cheered. It was not polite, it was real. Shaky, dazed, I rose from the bench. Faces swarmed toward me, smiling, eager, strangers offering praise and questions. What was that piece? Where can we hear more? Someone pressed a business card into my palm, murmuring about a gallery opening in desperate need of a pianist. Through the crowd I glimpsed my mother by the bar. Her smile was rigid, brittle, fixed in place like porcelain. The guest beside her gestured animatedly toward me, praising what they'd just heard, while her shoulders tightened and her jaw set in fury she couldn't afford to show. Then, Cassandra broke through and flung her arms around me. I froze for a moment, shocked. This was the first real embrace she'd given me in years. That was incredible, she whispered fiercely. You stole the show. I'm sorry, I blurted out, reflexively. I didn't mean to. Stop, she laughed, pulling back to look at me. Are you kidding? That was the most real thing that's happened in this entire wedding circus. Her eyes were shining. What was that piece? I've never heard it. I wrote it, I admitted softly. It's called Return. Her breath caught. You composed it? Audrey, she shook her head, speechless. That's beyond amazing. Richard joined us then, with Patricia at his side. Patricia took my hands in hers, her eyes gleaming. That was extraordinary, she said warmly. Richard told me you were talented, but I had no idea. Do you have a card? I chair the Arts Foundation board. We're always looking for gifted performers for our galas. I stammered something about accounting, about how I hadn't performed in years, but she only smiled knowingly, as if she saw through my excuses. And then, my mother arrived, her smile strained, her eyes glacial. Wasn't that lovely? She said, voice tight. Such a surprise, Audrey. The coordinator says it's time to wrap up. The string quartet is waiting for the dinner set. Actually, Patricia interrupted smoothly. I was just telling Audrey how much I'd love to hear more during dinner. The quartet can play later, but this was special. My mother's smile stiffened further, the corners trembling. Oh, but we've already arranged the schedule. I'm sure they won't mind a short break, Richard interjected, glancing at his mother. Audrey could play during the salad course. Judith hesitated, torn between her iron control and the pressure of her new in-laws. And then Cassandra delivered the final blow, her voice ringing clear. I think that's a wonderful idea. It's my wedding, after all, and I want to hear my sister play again. Checkmate. My mother's lips barely moved as she said, of course, dear, whatever you want. The quartet graciously adjusted, and I was moved from the shadowy corner to a place of prominence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't hidden, wasn't being managed, I was being seen. When I sat back down at the keys, it was not as the child who had failed, but as the woman who had reclaimed her voice. The music that followed wasn't just notes, it was liberation. And from the sidelines, I saw my mother watching me, expression unreadable, but laced with something new, not control, not scorn, something closer to fear, maybe even realization. Because for the first time, she knew, she no longer owned me.